Hello, everybody, and welcome in to another episode of the Couch GMs podcast. It is Friday, October 7th, 2022. I'm your host, George Kerth. Tyler Snyder could not be with us today. He's out in a hot air balloon trying to find some fantasy points over some mountain range somewhere. But Cody Roadcap is with us. Cody, how you doing here going into week 5?
I'm doing a lot better than my fantasy teams. I'll just say that.
I know you're having a little bit of a championship hangover in our league of record, but it seems like you're digging through the waiver wire quite often in other leagues too. So, hey, it'll get better. And we're going to talk about ways that you can win your week this week because we're going to break down every single week 5 game with our week 5 preview. And we're going to hit a couple news and notes that we might have missed back on our Tuesday show. Make sure you find us on thecouchgms.com and our social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok at The Couch GMs, and join our Discord chat. The link is in the description of the video or podcast you are watching or listening to. All right, let's jump into NFL news. I guess, Cody, you're probably not just jumping into the waiver wire. You're probably proposing some trades here, too. I know I've heard some rumblings of trades you proposed in our league of record, but nothing biting yet for you.
Nope, not at all. Not at all. It's been a tough fantasy season, but just some unfortunate injury luck, bad, misplayed matchups. I've had 2 weeks now where my bench has outscored my lineup in a game I've lost by 10 or less points. So just sometimes how the cookie crumbles, I believe, is the correct saying.
That is the correct saying, and we got to hit some news here. One that I found very interesting. Well, congrats to Cole Beasley, who announced his retirement from the NFL effective immediately. Back on, I want to say it was Tuesday. He spent 2 weeks with Tom Brady and the Buccaneers and decided that was the time to call it quits. I think the timing was very interesting, but what do you think here about this situation and about Cole Beasley's career in general?
Yeah, it's definitely, it was kind of like, I think, it was more he wanted to give it one more shot. He realized he was past the point. He wasn't, playing a lot of snaps, but it was a lot to get his body back in shape. And he didn't want to continue to push the whole season. Now the Bucs did release him. So even if he would in 6 weeks or next year decide to change his mind, his rights wouldn't revert to the Bucs. So that could be interesting, down the stretch, or maybe a team like Buffalo gets a lot of injuries or something like that, and he wants to go back to his old team. Something we could see. But Cole Beasley, one of those underrated slot players. Like, we're not talking Hall of Fame for Cole Beasley. He was a good slot player, wasn't anything spectacular. Right up there with your Wes Welkers, your Julian Edelmans, those guys that could just go get you a first down. They didn't light up the stat sheets. They had pretty sure hands. So congrats to Cole Beasley if this is it on a fantastic career.
Agreed. And then a little bit of other wide receiver news we have to talk about too. Wide receiver Andy Isabella, formerly of the Arizona Cardinals. He was released by the Cardinals and signed to the Ravens practice squad. Probably not a significant move, but somebody I thought was going to have a chance to break out in a lot of these injuries in the beginning of the season, and it did not work out for him here in Arizona.
Yeah, and we'll see if anything, happens with Isabella, or if he was just a guy that was drafted before DK Metcalf that won't get a second contract.
I have a little bit of PTSD there from you saying drafted before DK Metcalf, just like I do drafted before Justin Jefferson. But anyway, I think that's all the news we have to hit. We have a lot of injury news, but why don't we talk that as we break down every single game in our Week 5 preview. Starting off here, our Week 5 preview. Actually, this is important to note. Make sure you're getting yourself set up for your bye weeks here in your fantasy leagues. This is the last week before bye weeks begin. So make sure you're kind of taking a look ahead, making sure that 3/4 of your team doesn't have a bye week in week 6 or anything like that. But we have another London game as well, which I also have to say be ready for, because 85% of owners started Alvin Kamara last week when he was inactive in London. And the London game this week is the New York Giants against the Green Bay Packers. I feel like I have to let Cody take it away to start here and give us a little update on how the Packers are looking in London.
All right, so I'd be glad to. Fortunately, if you are a fantasy player and you don't like getting up early on a Sunday, or you're a West Coast listener and this game is at 6:30 a.m. and you're just like, I partied too hard on Saturday, I'm not getting up for it. There's not like a true, you know, top end fantasy player like an Alvin Kamara that is cheater tottering whether he's going to play or not. Um, both these teams have dealt with injuries. They don't really have a quote unquote number one wide receiver. Saquon is a must start for the Giants. Aaron Jones is a must start for the Packers. And then after that, it's kind of hit or miss. I mean, the Packers definitely have some better options. You have A.J. Dillon, which could be a solid flex option this week. Romeo Dobbs is looking like a really productive fourth round draft pick. He has touchdowns in back to back weeks. He could have had a really big day if he held on to that touchdown at the end of the game. A guy that is getting more and more confidence with Aaron Rodgers. So he could be a guy. Alan Lazard had over 100 yards last week. He was limited this week, but I think they're just still being cautious with the ankle like they have the last 2 weeks. So he'd be a name. And then you have to look at tight end Robert Tunyon. He caught a touchdown as well last week. Still not getting a bunch of targets, but would be a red zone threat if you wanted to take a shot in the dark at tight end. On the Giants side, Kenny Galladay did not travel with the team. Richie James and Wandell Robinson are limited. Kadarius Toney went from limited to DNP. And that pretty much only leaves, is it David Stills, the fourth? I
Yeah, I
believe
think it's
is.
David Stills. Yeah.
So yeah, that would be like the top guy, and he's probably not even rostered in most fantasy leagues. So
Anywhere.
I don't think I'd play him this week. And the Packers could be getting Jair Alexander back to, add to their secondary. Adrian Amos coming out of concussion protocol, possibly as he moved to a limited participant. So their secondary could be getting better. So really from the Giants side, it is only Saquon Barkley. George, how did I do?
I think you did very well. I didn't expect you to even hit the Giants side too, but you did. I will say one thing to add on top. If you're in a league that lets you drop players from your bench in the middle of the week, I do not hate at all going out there and adding Wandale Robinson. If he plays, you have a chance to see if he's going to break out as a number one wide receiver in New York. They've been having a lot of hype around him since camp. He just hasn't been healthy enough to play yet. And if he either doesn't play or plays poorly, you drop him, pick up another flyer for the 1 o'clock, 4 o'clock window. So that would be the only thing I'd add on to what you said.
I like it. So why don't we move on to that 1 o'clock window with a game that if this was played a few years ago or decades ago, it might have been a little bit better, but it's probably going to be a little bit one-sided this week as the Pittsburgh Steelers with new quarterback Kenny Pickett travel to the Buffalo Bills. George, take it away.
All right, I'll start on the Pittsburgh Steelers side where Kenny Pickett is the starting quarterback and top wide receiver Deontay Johnson was a limited participant in practice. He probably is going to go. But I'm questioning if I would play him, if I would play George Pickens, if I would play neither, because this Buffalo Bills defense is solid, and I don't expect Pickett to exactly eat in this game. I feel like if you're in a situation where you have Johnson, you might have to play him and hope. I think he's still going to be the number one target there, but Pickens definitely got a boost when they put in Pickett. That's gonna tongue tie me so many times this year and beyond. I could see it already. But then, so I think you're starting Najee Harris, and that's probably about it on the Pittsburgh side if you can help it. About Pat Fryermuth, my bad. I almost missed Pat Fryermuth. I think he's probably going to be a fairly solid or top of the dartboard tight end for you because he's going to get volume. And then on the Bills side, Isaiah McKenzie was a limited participant in practice. He is dealing with concussion symptoms, but most of the time when you see a concussion be a limited participant on a Thursday, they're going to be cleared through protocol before the game. But definitely keep an eye on it just in case. Dawson Knox did not practice on Thursday. I would not touch any other tight ends in the offense if Knox doesn't go, and I might even just stay away from Knox if you can help it, just if he's going to be hurt and limited. But Gabe Davis was back to a full participant, so I still like going back to your starting Stephon Diggs and you're starting Gabe Davis, and that's probably where I would try to leave it for Buffalo.
I'll throw one more name out there. Devin Singletary. I think he is the guy we can finally trust in the running back position for the Buffalo Bills. He's been getting the targets, he's been getting the opportunities, he's been getting the rushing yards. He's not like out of this mind, fantastic with it. There's still a pass first offense, but he's been a guy that you can rely on. And like I mentioned at the top when I introduced this game, this isn't the Steelers of old. They're currently ranked 25th against fantasy running backs. So Devin Singletary in a positive matchup, I think he could be a RB2 flex option this week. And then the one name I did want to do a little bit of rebuttaling against, Pat Fryermuth. Now, if you listened on our podcast that came out on Tuesday, we mentioned how the biggest benefactor from the quarterback change is probably Pat Fryermuth. However, it's probably not this week, in my opinion. The Buffalo Bills are still number 2 ranked against fantasy tight ends. They're not allowing the points. They've had some injuries in their secondaries, but they're Matt Milano, Traymon Edmonds. Those guys have been really good at covering tight ends across the middle of the field. So I would hold off on a week of Pat Fryermuth if I can. I know the tight end dartboard is very sparse and everyone is about on the same playing level. So if you really want to take a risk, it's not like the worst play, but just know it is a really tough matchup for him.
I like it. I mean, I would see if there's other options out there, but don't just go out there and start some random tight end way down the dartboard instead of Pat Fryermuth, I would say, because you still probably have a decent shot of getting a couple of catches out of Fryermuth. But one tight end you might like better than Cody would have to be Gerald Everett, who is on the LA Chargers, who are traveling to the Cleveland Browns. Now it is a West Coast team traveling east at 1 o'clock. I had to steal the thunder from you there a little bit, but they are still missing Keenan Allen. Maybe that means more targets there for Gerald Everett. I also think that gives a nice little boost to Mike Williams. And Justin Herbert was a full participant in practice with his rib injury. I still think he's probably going to be feeling it for a few weeks, but hopefully he's starting to turn the corner. It looked better last week. And then obviously Austin Eckler had the breakout. You're not going to bench him anyway. Sticking with that, I don't think there's anybody else worth noting here for the Chargers.
Yeah, I mean, you pretty much took the words right out of my mouth. If a tight end in Gerald Everett. Now I know the Browns; they are number 8 against fantasy tight ends, so it's a tough matchup. But we have consistently seen Gerald Everett be a big part of this offense, especially with the absence of Keenan Allen. And after his setback last week, he's not practicing, not expected to go. So I do like Gerald Everett. And you mentioned Herbert is only going to get better. There was no harm of furthering injury. It was just a matter of pain management and would get better each week. So he is healthier this week than he was last week. So I do like playing Gerald Everett over a Pat Fryermuth and some other tight ends, even in what would be considered not a great matchup.
And then swinging over to the Browns side, I feel like we have to ask every single week, are there any wide receivers that you would think about on the Browns? Is Amari Cooper still kind of like hiding up there as like he's a solid guy every single week? Are you still playing him by matchup?
I mean, I'm probably still playing him. He's not the guy, the potential wide receiver 1 that he was a few years ago. But I think his talent is too good, and they try to get him the ball, that he is probably in your lineups most week, with the expectations that he has the potential to finish inside the top 12, but he'll most likely be a top 24 guy. So you're wide receiver 2. I might have said RB at the beginning, but I meant wide receiver and a flex option. So he would still be in my lineup. He has looked pretty decent outside of the first week. He did have a little bit slower of a week last week, but he's still shown he is the number 1 pass catching option in that offense.
I just want to pull up his stats here really fast. I want to see if it's a predictable back and forth or if it is just absolutely a mess. No, I mean, not really. Week 1 was bad. Weeks 2 and 3 were good, and week 4 was bad. So I mean, maybe he'll go one off, 2 on, 1 off. I mean, I was thinking it was going to be back and forth. So it'd be like, don't play or do play him this week. He was bad last week. Don't play him the week after. It doesn't actually work that way, but it'd be funny if it did. I think I'm basically sticking to the Nick Chubb, flexible Kareem Hunt in this situation. David Njoku on the dartboard. He was out of practice on Wednesday, but I think it was just for rest, so he should be just a management issue. He's good to go. I think that pretty much wraps up Chargers Browns, and we can move on to the Houston Texans traveling to the Jacksonville Jaguars. What an exciting matchup we have here. I guess the Jaguars are a little better. But the first game we're going to hit with no significant injuries on either side. So I know that we're pretty much in on Dameon Pierce in your lineup every single week at this point. He's getting great volume. And we were questioning the viability of one Brandon Cooks coming into this episode. Where are you at on Brandon Cooks against the Jaguars?
Yeah, that is a tough one. I mean, it all depends on who you have. Were you able to get a Chris Olave later in the draft that you can swap him out for? Um, you know, I don't know if I'm even as a Packers fan, I don't know if I'm ready to say I would start Romeo Dobbs, a guy you picked up off waivers, over a Brandon Cooks. He has had some chemistry issues with Davis Mills, but he found the end zone last week. He's a pretty solid option. So if I can keep him in my flex spot or as my wide receiver too, I probably would. Not saying there's not better options out there. If you got lucky, or even like a Garrett Wilson, he might be a little bit of a guy that you were able to draft later that you can now pass him. But we're still in that early season. There hasn't been too many, huge breakout guys or huge waiver wire hits that I think Brandon Cooks is probably still in your lineup.
All right, and I haven't had a chance to take a look at your start sit article yet, and I'm kind of curious if you were in on a stream of a Trevor Lawrence in a game against the Houston Texans. Where are you at on that?
Okay, so that's actually very interesting. Um, you haven't seen it because it hasn't actually been posted yet. It'll be posted by the time this podcast is out. But Trevor Lawrence is a guy I originally had on my start list, but then I did a little bit deeper diving and I moved him to the sit list. Now, maybe it was I got a little scared after the five turnover game he had last week. Granted, the conditions were not great. And
Yes.
once you look at it, the Houston Texans, they have no wins in the win columns. They have a tie. They haven't, been great, but they still are, the number 8, I believe, defense against fantasy quarterbacks. So they've been doing something, whether that is, they're just relying on Dameon Pierce and they're slowing the game down, not allowing for the opportunity to put up a couple 100-yard passing game, or, they're getting beat so much through the run that the quarterback hasn't been able to be passed. Whatever the case may be, the numbers would say that Trevor Lawrence, despite what in our minds would be a positive matchup, he might not be a great streaming option this week.
Interesting. I like that little bit of a deeper dive because I totally thought it was a potential to stream Trevor Lawrence game, maybe pump the brakes. I do think this is now the rebound of the Jaguars running backs, though. I think I have no problem starting ETN or James Robinson. They could not get going last week, but this week I expect them to have a lead, try to salt a game down a little bit. And I don't think you're starting any Jags receivers outside of just Christian Kirk.
Yeah, and the only other guy I would say is that you probably can go out and play would be Evan Ingram. Now, this is a complete shot in the dark because he had the really good week 1, and then he's had some pretty poor performance the last 3 weeks. But the Texans, they're in the bottom half against tight ends. So this again, not allowing as many yardages to help your fantasy quarterbacks, but they have been giving up something to some other positions. So Christian Kirk, I expect to get his. And then Evan Ingram, if you need a surprise player, you're looking for a really cheap option in a daily fantasy matchup that probably not a lot of people are going to pick. I think Evan Ingram is an interesting name. He's not a must start, but a guy that you might want to take a closer look at.
I like it, and then we can move on to our next game, a divisional matchup between the Chicago Bears and the Minnesota Vikings. Big question coming in for Chicago is the running back room. David Montgomery was a limited participant in practice on Wednesday and Thursday. I know a lot of us fantasy owners with Montgomery want him to come back and, take over that role again. I don't think that's going to happen with how good Khalil Herbert has been, but how much is Montgomery going to take away from Herbert if he does play? So let's start with the hypothetical of Montgomery does go. Would you start either of them?
Oh, that is a tough one. So Khalil Herbert has looked really, really good in his absence. And because Montgomery is limited, the offense has not been that great, though. So I don't want to, even if he would
It
only
wasn't
get 10
great with him
opportunities.
either, though. Like,
But,
there's
but
that too.
what I was saying or what I was trying to hint at was if, even if they hold Montgomery limited and they're like, even if we give him a super low snap count or pitch count, we're like, he's going to get 10 opportunities this game. Khalil Herbert's going to get everything else. 10 opportunities is, roughly 18 to 20% of the snaps this offense has run because they can't stay on the field. So that is a big chunk just going to one player that makes me think if he goes, I might pull back on either of them unless something comes out and is like, full workload for David Montgomery, but I don't expect that to happen. So if David Montgomery goes, I would probably pull back the reins on both of them. If you made me choose, though, I would pick Khalil Herbert because he's been the more explosive one, and hope that he might get the end zone touchdown, or he might get the 45-yard rushing touchdown if there is a big play. Um,
Mhm.
but if Montgomery goes, it is not a matchup I really like either of the running backs in.
And that's the only position I would think about even starting a Chicago Bear because they're still throwing -3 passes a game. But on the Vikings side, obviously looking a lot better. I don't know if you want to play Kirk in this kind of matchup if you can help it, because the Bears defense has been the bright spot of that team. So it might be a little bit of a tough matchup, but you can't go sitting someone like a Justin Jefferson, Dalvin Cook. Irv Smith might even be on the dartboard. I don't know what you think, Cody.
Yeah, I think Kirk Cousins, I mean, if you could find, there's probably a couple other streaming options out there that you might be able to pivot to. The Bears are 12th against fantasy quarterbacks. So not the best streaming option. Divisional matchups are also always weird. They're always closer despite what the teams are. Justin Jefferson, he's definitely in your lineup. Irv Smith, again, he's like the dartboard guy. He's going to be on the dartboard pretty much every week, and it's, do you want to play him or not? But the guy I want to ask you about is Adam Thielen. Now, again, you mentioned the Bears, very good, currently number 2 ranked against fantasy wide receivers. But Adam Thielen has had back-to-back double-digit point games in half-point PPR. He had 8 targets in week 3, 9 targets in week 4. Justin Jefferson still got his in week 4, so it wasn't like Justin Jefferson had a really bad game and Adam Thielen got out. They both had really good games last week. Is Adam Thielen in flexible category, or are you still too worried about that Bears defense?
I'm probably having pretty low in the flex rankings because of the matchup. But it is nice to see that he is becoming more of a fantasy relevant guy. If he happens to do it in this matchup, then I think he probably can be labeled as that every week flex starter that we had him labeled as coming into the season. Um, but I'm not touching him just in case in this matchup because I feel like if the Vikings get 2 touchdowns, it's a better chance that it goes 1 to Dalvin Cook, 1 to Justin Jefferson, and Adam Thielen's probably left out on that.
Solid. Yeah. Very team dependent. If you're a team, that is really depleted at the wide receiver position, maybe you had a Keenan Allen, so you don't really have the option. You can put him back out there, but just know it is not a great matchup for the fantasy wide receivers. But Justin Jefferson transcends rankings, and he's in your lineup every single week. But the next matchup is still in the NFC North with the Detroit Lions. That explosive offense and terrible defense is headed to New England to take on Brian Hoyer. Is not going to be there. He's on IR. Mac Jones, maybe. Bailey Zappi. I want to just say Zape so
Zappy.
bad. Why is it Zappy? Why do I potentially didn't look bad in his force in action last week. But let's start on the Patriots side because I think that side's a little bit simpler.
Is
The
it?
running backs.
Oh, yeah.
I,
I think you're playing
I,
both against the Lions. Yeah.
right, it's the running backs. I don't think
Yeah.
Johnny Smith. He's hurt. He's out. If Hunter Henry again, he's right there with Irv Smith. Like flip a coin, dartboard. The matchup is probably better for Hunter Henry, but with a potential third string quarterback making
Yeah.
his first career start, not the best option in a
But,
game that
like, if Mac Jones goes and they say he's going to be okay, and Jacoby Myers goes, who was limited participant in practice today, or Thursday, I should say, um, I kind of don't mind throwing a flex flyer out on Jacoby Myers because I think like even with Zappy, I feel like this team's going to score points just because the Lions can't stop anybody. But with Mac Jones in there, I'd be confident enough to throw that out there.
yeah. See, I think I guess I'm more leaning. I'm more on the mindset that Zappy is going to get the start. I guess it's going to be. I think it's going to be another week for Mac Jones. So maybe my opinions are a little bit biased because that's what my thinking is. But with Zappy going, I could think this might be very similar to what we saw in that crazy weather Buffalo Bills game because we talked about the running backs. Like the Lions can't really stop anything right now. They're 31st ranked against fantasy running backs. If Zappe, dropped back 10 times the whole game, that wouldn't surprise me. Like, and even with Mac Jones out there with
Possible.
on a bum ankle, like that that's a real possibility. too. So if Mac Jones goes, I could definitely, maybe you want to take a flyer on Jacoby Myers because they've been putting up so much points. But if they run it 40 times and, this game goes by in 2.5 hours because the clock doesn't stop, that I feel like that's a real possibility for this game as well.
Yeah, that's actually one way I never thought of it. And we could also say, like, are you worried about the Lions because everyone's still banged up? Like, Amon-Ra St. Brown, DeAndre Swift still did not practice on Thursday. DJ Chark, Josh Reynolds were both limited. None of those guys, I mean, Josh Reynolds was one of those guys that played last week, and they still put up 45 points in a loss. So even though the Patriots defense probably better than Seattle, I still don't see a problem with Detroit putting up points. And I also don't hate playing Josh Reynolds as a potential flex flyer as well if Amon-Ra St. Brown does not go, which looks like he's not going to.
As long as Josh Reynolds also plays, because he found himself on the injury report. And I know it's not a great matchup for fantasy running backs, but I think if Swift doesn't go, you would still play Jamal Williams. If Swift does go, though, because it is a poor matchup, this might be very similar to Chicago. I might even pull back, unless they say Swift is going to get full work, but I imagine he's going to get some type of limited if he does go. I might even pull both of them back, just because the Patriots have not allowed a rushing touchdown to any running back through 4 weeks. So their run defense has been very good.
I get that, but I'm also thinking back to when we looked at week 2 with DeAndre Swift. He was limited. He only ended up with 5 carries, but he just breaks big plays. He still had 14, I think it was 14 standard points in fantasy. I was looking at a different, thing for my fantasy points there. It's throwing me off a little bit, but he still can have relevance on few carries, and I feel like he's one of the few guys who is matchup proof at the running back position. So if you're going to hear like, oh, he's like basically there as an emergency option, don't play him. But I feel like if he's going to get limited work, he still could be a fantasy relevant, like flex category type running back for you.
Understand. The only thing is that just remember week 2 was against Washington. It's not the same tier as the Patriots running back. But if you had to bet on one, like I said, I would bet on Khalil Herbert. I would bet on DeAndre Swift because touchdown regression you think is going to come for the touchdown leader in Jamal Williams with his limited opportunities. But if Swift doesn't go, I would still be pretty confident starting Jamal Williams even against this poor matchup or in a poor matchup. But why don't we talk about the team that did beat the Detroit Lions in the surprise shootout of the year, we're going to call it, last week when the Seattle Seahawks beat them 48-45. Two teams I didn't expect to break 40, especially in the same game coming into the season. They're going to the New Orleans Saints. The Saints that hurt a lot of fantasy owners when at, 8 a.m. Eastern time, they were like, oh, Alvin Kamara is not going to play. And a lot of people missed it. George hinted at it, 85% of people last week played Alvin Kamara. But this week he said he's feeling like himself. He was a limited participant, but he expects it to be out there. So I think if he is out there, you're putting Kamara back in your lineup.
Yeah, do not just be bitter because they pulled him at the last second on you last week. You have to play Alvin Kamara, especially at his level against the Seahawks defense, which has not been fantastic. But that offense still might not be too great otherwise because Michael Thomas did not practice. Jameis Winston did not practice. So we could end up seeing another Andy Dalton with a couple snap from Taysom Hill game. I think Chris Olave is a fantastic play this week. He has probably moved into wide receiver 2 territory for at least this week without Michael Thomas in there. I think that's about all I've got for the Saints, though.
All right, so I'm going to take one for Snyder since he's not here. Chris Olave is wide receiver 1 on the New Orleans Saints. He's past Michael Thomas. He's past Michael Thomas. He's past Jarvis Landry. He's wide receiver number 1. We heard all draft season, Chris Olave is the most pro-ready prospect in the draft. There were some concerns about potential ceiling, potential height. Could he play on the boundary? So far, he has proven that. And it hasn't just been with Jameis Winston. He did it again last week with Andy Dalton. He had 7 targets he had 7 targets, only went for 4 receptions, 6-7 yards, and a touchdown. Week before that, he had 13 targets. Week before that, he had 13 targets. Like, he is becoming the number 1 guy. We're not expecting Michael Thomas. Chris Olave is on the brink of becoming an every week starter.
And in a matchup now against Seattle as compared to the Vikings are a much tougher defense than Seattle's is. So definitely smash the play button on Chris Olave. And if you drafted him late, steal. I know he's helped me in a couple dynasty leagues I drafted him in that I'm weak at the wide receiver position, but don't have to really worry about it because you just slot in him.
Yeah, and actually, if you actually look at the numbers, the Seattle Seahawks, again, I think this is very similar to Houston. They're actually number 7 against fantasy wide receivers. So if you're on, Sleeper or NFL.com, like you might see red, Yahoo, you might see red next to the Seattle Seahawks, but it's okay. Chris Olave can still be in your lineup.
Just not Jarvis Landry. Don't go out there and overreact to seeing the name Seattle.
Correct.
Yes. Okay. I think that can wrap that up. So we have another divisional game here to look at. The Miami Dolphins traveling to the New York Jets. So starting on the Dolphins side, we're not going to see any Tua Tagovailoa this week. He is out with that concussion neck head injury. And both wide receivers actually hit the injury report. Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill were both limited. They are expected to go. We'll have to see if they limit them at all. Plus, if the quarterback play limits them at all. Are you worried at all about playing either, even without Tua? Or is it just kind of these two guys are in your lineup because they have such big play potential, and you just have to take it if they get a dud?
Yeah, I'll answer that question, but real quick, I want to go back to the last one because I don't think we actually hit on the Seattle Seahawks too
My
much.
bad.
We didn't talk. We completely blew, which is understandable. I mean, they did put up 48 points last week, but there isn't a lot of options with the Seattle Seahawks. So we'll get to the Dolphins Jets just a second. But one, DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett. Tyler Lockett had a pretty good game last week, but I don't expect that to continue against the New Orleans Saints. But I did want to just point out, if you look at their projected stats on NFL.com and fantasy half-point PPR, we are now back to, is it a Tyler Lockett or is it a DK Metcalf week? As DK Metcalf is projected 12.12 and Tyler Lockett is projected 12.11. So they're saying it's going to be decaf by 0.01 points. So that's where we're at with fantasy projections. And then Rashad Penny, he also looked really good last week. I know there were some worries about Kenneth Walker. Again, not a great matchup for this week. So there's not a lot of, fantasy input. But if you had to pick between Kenneth Walker and Rashad Penny, for now, it just still does seem like Rashad Penny's job.
It does, but I am worried a little bit because I'm trying to see if there actually was an updated injury report for Thursday on Seattle. Rashad Penny did not practice on Wednesday, and I don't see any update for Thursday yet. So we'll have to keep you updated on our Twitter page. But if he doesn't go, are you confident enough to start a Ken Walker or DJ Dallas? Is he the other one that's still there? I forget which one of the other guys.
Yeah, DJ
hurt.
Dallas is still there. I definitely would not start him. Kenneth Walker, if he didn't go, but it does look like, according to the Seattle Times, it doesn't say what the status was, if it was limited or full, but Penny did return to practice on Thursday. So hopefully we get the report by the time you're projecting it. Obviously, we'll update you guys on Sunday morning on Twitter, on Facebook. We put out a whole list of inactives to help you guys out, and you guys can shoot us some fantasy questions if you do need them. So that's one to monitor. If Penny wouldn't go, I think you play Walker. If Penny does go, I think you play Penny.
I'm with you there. And I think now that we did cover the Seahawks, I'm sorry I missed them, any Seahawks fans out there or fantasy owners out there. But back to the Dolphins. No Tua, Waddle and Hill on the injury report. Are you worried about them too at all?
If we hear that they're going to be on a snap count or something like that, again, that is something that we'll update you about on Sunday morning. But if they're out there, I'm playing them. Teddy Bridgewater played pretty well in relief last week. He wasn't quite able to get it done to pull out the victory. He's a veteran. He's, been a part of, getting guys some points. These guys are playmakers. They both have the ability to take a 5-yard pass and turn it into a 75-yard touchdown. So for me, Waddle and Hill, they're about as every week starters as you can get.
All right, I like it. And then I'm just going to tease you here a little bit with the running back position because I know you were team Chase Edmonds and I was always team Raheem Mostert. And Mostert is taking over a lot of the carries. Jets, pretty favorable matchup. Would you think about a potential flex for a Raheem Mostert?
I feel like I'm on the same path as I was last week when I was like, oh, you can't start this guy, you can't start this guy, and then by the end of the show, I was like, I don't know if I said you can start any running back. So I'll answer it this way: if I was going to pick one, I would pick Raheem Mostert.
Mhm.
However, Chase Edmonds is still getting the red zone work. He dropped another touchdown last week. So I say another, so it has happened more than once. So maybe he'll stop getting opportunities, but he's getting pass catching touchdown opportunities. He just hasn't been able to capitalize on them. Unfortunately, I do think that makes Chase Edmonds completely uh, touchdown dependent, which I don't like. Raheem Mostert might have some more yardage, some big playability. So if I had to pick one, I would play Raheem Mostert. I don't love either of them, but if I had to go one, it'd be Raheem Mostert.
Okay. And then moving on to the Jets side, I just want to say I think the Brees Hall coming out party is happening. It's officially here because he really did dominate the touches in that Jets backfield compared to Michael Carter last week. And now coming into a game where I think they could probably pace a little better with Miami than they could if Tua was out there and their offense was running at 100%. I like Brees Hall in this game, and I think now your window to play Michael Carter has finally closed.
Yeah, I think this is a tough matchup for both of them. Brees Hall is a limited participant. It sounds like he's going to go. If he doesn't, then Michael Carter could probably be in your lineup. But again, we
Mm-hmm.
talk a lot about the Miami Dolphins offense, but this defense is how they beat the Bills. This defense has been keeping them in games. This defense has been making plays, and this defense is currently seventh against fantasy running backs. So it's not a walk in the park matchup for either of these running backs. And if it is a split, it could get dicey if Michael Carter is still involved, just because how well this team is. Again, it's divisional. Crazy things can happen. If I had to pick one, it'd be Brees Hall. But again, it's another matchup. If I had different options, I would play someone else over both of them.
I have a feeling you're going to say the same thing about the wide receivers when I ask you the whole Elijah Moore versus Garrett Wilson versus even Corey Davis, who seems to be still leading that team. He tied for the lead in targets. He led the team in receiving yards and receptions. He got the touchdown. Like, I feel like this would be a lot better for fantasy wide receivers if Corey Davis wasn't getting all these catches, because that would just be, 5 catches a week for Elijah Moore, 5, 6 catches a week for Garrett Wilson. But instead, it just seems like they're spreading the ball out so much that it's so hard to predict who's going to be the guy, especially after only 1 week serving size of Zach Wilson so far. Personally, I'm trying to avoid him if I can. And I have a feeling you're going to say the same exact thing.
Yeah, if I was going to, I would avoid them, but I'll rank them for you and how I would feel the most confident playing them. And that would
Mhm.
be Garrett Wilson, then it would be Elijah Moore, then it would be Corey Davis. If at the end of the week it's completely flopped, I would not be surprised. So understand what I'm saying when I'm saying I'm ranking my confidence. It's not by a wide margin between any of them, but I think it would be Garrett Wilson, Elijah Moore, and then Corey Davis. And it is also worth noting that, like, I believe the quote that I saw circling around after Wednesday's practice was Zach Wilson can do enough. Like, he's still battling some injuries. Like, and I mean, if you just, he can do enough, like, that's not a vote of confidence for your starting quarterback that you're hoping can
Yeah.
throw it around the yard and put up some fantasy points. So George is right. If you can pivot, pivot. But if you have to pick one, I'd go with Garrett Wilson.
I'm with you, and I think now we can move on to divisional matchup between the Atlanta Falcons and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And I'm going to start with the Falcons backfield because we all were saying to add Tyler Algier before this week coming in here. And now his first matchup as a starter has to come against the number one run defense in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I actually don't know if they're number one still statistically because the Chiefs did find a lot of yards against them last week, but still, I don't know if I really want to touch that. Even with Atlanta's commitment to the run game, like last week, they won that game just saying we're going to run the ball down your throat, and I still don't think they can replicate that matchup this week.
Yeah, I'd be out on Algier, whatever his name is. One day I will get it right. And I'm so sorry for Tyler out there. Eventually I will get your name right. And I'm also out on Caleb Huntley, which was like the sneaky ad that I recommended on Tuesday. I wouldn't play him. The Buccaneers did go to, at least in terms of against fantasy running backs, they are number 3 as the Rams have now hold the top spot. But still, it's too tough of a matchup. They lost Kyle Pitts. Well, they didn't lose Kyle Pitts, but he is not practicing, um, which is a little bit concerning for his availability. He hasn't been, great this season. He's been a big disappointment for where he was getting drafted. Marcus Mariota only had 7 completions last year. Like, this does not seem like a great matchup to really play any Falcons, in my opinion.
Thinking they might fall behind, you wouldn't even think about a Drake London as a little bit of a flex option?
I honestly, maybe I would, but the
Without
Buccaneers
Pitts
have,
especially?
without Pitts though, like, I also wonder, does that make it a little bit tougher? Like, has Pitts been the guy, we're going to shut down
Fair.
this guy, and Drake London has reaped the benefits, and now it's like, okay, we're going to try to slow down Drake London. And don't forget, this Buccaneers defense is a top defense. I don't have the stats in front of me, but I know they're top 3 in sacks. They're top 3 in takeaways. Like, they cause turnovers. They make a lot of things happen. And the Buccaneers, yes, they did put up points last week, but they haven't been a elite offense that we were expecting. It was last week was, I believe, the first time all season they scored a touchdown in the first half. It's divisional. It could be a lot closer than we're expecting. So I would pivot away from the Falcons, but again, it feels like it might be a broken record. If you're going to make me pick one, it would be Drake London, but I would try to find something else.
All right, and then the Buccaneers side of the ball, we were worried a little bit about Tom Brady dealing with shoulder and finger injuries on Wednesday, but he went back to a full participant in practice on Thursday, so it's probably just more of a maintenance thing. And then he's expected to play. We have Mike Evans in, and the other wide receivers, Russell Gage, Chris Godwin, Julio Jones, all limited participants. But the fact that they're limited on Thursday means they all have a good chance to go, especially the ones that played last week. So you're starting Evans. I think this obviously opens the door for Brady to play against a mediocre defense in Atlanta. But is there a second wide receiver? And I mean, I'm personally thinking it's Chris Godwin, or is there a reason that you would say it's Julio instead?
With I think Chris Godwin, if he goes, he's a no-brainer. He had 10 targets in his return to action last week. Falcons, they're currently ranked 26th against fantasy wide receivers. Like, it is a really good matchup. And because it's such a good matchup, I think we could even, I could be talked into a Julio Jones this week if he returns to action as a flexible option. Like, I like Julio Jones better than Drake London in the same matchup if Julio would to go. I probably would like Julio Jones over the Jets wide receivers in that matchup. That'd be very close between him and Garrett Wilson, but that's the kind of tier I think he could be in a plus matchup, trying to get back. But again, that's all hinged on that he actually plays this week.
And then I'll have you play a little bit of panic button here before we move on from this game. We talked a little bit about the Leonard Fournette performance last week. That was a whole 3 carries, did not look great. He actually matched the same amount of carries as Rachaad White. Are you panicking on Leonard Fournette, or because it's a great matchup, you have to just roll him out?
It's a not like a pound the table great matchup, but it is still a good enough matchup. And ironically, in terms of fantasy points, Leonard Fournette had his best game of the season last year. Obviously, that's because he found the end zone. So I think
Yep.
he is still, and the running back has what you could replace him with. I think you still have to take the opportunity with Leonard Fournette.
Okay. And I think that'll basically wrap up Falcons Buccaneers. We can move on to the Tennessee Titans traveling to the Washington Commanders. I know Tyler's going to be in attendance there. It's probably where he's riding his hot air balloon to when he's looking for his fantasy points. But I think I'm going to try to step in Tyler's shoes really quick here and talk some Titans because you're going to start Derrick Henry. He's probably good. We probably try to convince you that Ryan Tannehill is a potential streamer at quarterback, which possibly could be. This matchup against the Commanders is pretty good. But when it comes to the pass catchers, Traylon Burks did not practice on Thursday. As we said on our Tuesday show, he is expected to miss a couple of weeks, at least a minimum of 2. So if there's going to be a Robert Woods breakout game, I think this is the game it's going to happen.
I think you could be right. I was going to say the same thing. I do like Robert Woods. this week. Not like a guy I'm gonna, sit one of my top guys for. I'm not gonna like super chase
Mhm.
points, but if I have a flexible option or need someone to fill in, Robert Woods could be the guy. The Commanders' defense hasn't been the best. You can tell they're still missing Chase Young. The secondary has been a little banged up. Um, so yeah, Robert Woods will be interesting. They're probably going to load up the box to try to stop a guy like Derrick Henry. So yeah, I do like Robert Woods this week, but he's probably him and Derrick Henry are probably the only two Titans. Ryan Tannehill, if you want to take a streamer, but I would actually rather play Carson Wentz in this matchup than I would
Hmm.
Ryan Tannehill.
Carson Wentz, even when you're looking at Jahan Dotson, is expected to be out. He did not practice. Curtis Samuel was also listed as a DNP, but he has an illness, so I'm assuming they're just trying to get him back up to full health before they give him any practice loads. So he'll probably be good to go. But I seem to always try to forget that they still have Terry McLaurin there too, so they still do have weapons around Carson Wentz. That'd be tough for me if I'm trying to decide Carson Wentz or Ryan Tannehill. I'm hoping you have better options, like you're able to go get a Jared Goff off of free agency or something. But I might actually lean Tannehill, so I think I'd be against you there, but it's close.
Yeah, I think it's just because we've seen top end performances out of Carson Wentz. For me, he's still ranked as a QB 10 on the season. The Titans are 25th against fantasy quarterbacks. Now, granted, the Commanders are 26. So if you want to say, well, statistically, they're slightly a little bit better, so I'm going to go with Ryan Tannehill. But we just haven't seen Tannehill put up the points because a lot of them have gone to Derrick Henry. They're a run first team. Not the Commanders, they try to move the ball. I mean, Antonio Gibson has looked better than uh, I expected him to, or expect the way it was sounding in training camp. He's looked a lot better than JD McKissick has been a huge part of the passing game, which makes now that Brian Robinson's window is officially open, which congrats to him on making it back to practicing after his incident of getting shot in the leg after a robbery attempt. So we're happy for him, but that's just going to make this running back room a little bit cloudier once he gets back there. He's still on technically on IR, so he probably won't play this week, but at least as it opened up. But if Samuel's out there, which we're expecting, McLaurin's still out there. They still have Logan Thomas, J.D. McKissick out of the backfield. They still have second-year player Diami Brown. I know he hasn't shown a lot, but he could, make a little bit of, be at least a guy that steps up this week. I like the pass catching options outside of for Carson Wentz than I do the Tennessee Titans, and we're just 2 weeks removed where the Titans made Matt Collins look like an NFL superstar. So
You're
there's
right.
another thing. The only thing I will say, and this might be kind of where you're going to tip your hand to Ryan Tannehill, is the offensive line. The best part about the Tennessee Titans is their pass rush, led by Jeffrey Simmons. If they can tee off on the Commanders' offensive line, similar to how the Eagles did, and Wentz ends up getting sacked 9 times, they would, that's why they're one of my favorite streams this week because those sack points add up quickly. So that is my big concern. Can Wentz stay healthy? But because of how many points they've allowed to quarterbacks, if he can't stay upright, I think he'll have a good game.
I agree with you there. And just to give a little bit more of a background on the injured reserve thing with Brian Robinson, if you don't know. So the practice window, they give players 21 days to practice with the team before they have to be activated off of injured reserve, or they get reverted back to injured reserve where they are on it for the remainder of the season. They're allowed to be taken off. Um, and in that time where they're in that 21-day window, they can practice with the team, but we do not get practice reports because he's still technically on injured reserve. So we can't tell if Brian Robinson is practicing fully, practicing limited. So it's really hard to tell when he's going to be activated. But I would assume because he's still on it, he won't be playing this week. And it is still a way to, you can still play Antonio Gibson fairly confidently. But we can move on to the 4 o'clock window then, where it's the San Francisco 49ers traveling to the Carolina Panthers. And I think the big question on the 49ers is George Kittle has not started too well since he came back from his injury. And I'm sure fantasy owners are getting a little bit tired of it. They had to wait 2 weeks to get him in their lineup, and then he comes back and puts up 2 duds. Is there any worry about George Kittle, especially with that 49ers offense not exactly looking amazing with Jimmy Garoppolo like we expected it to?
Yeah, and I think one expectations is or expected to is an interesting way to put it because I don't know if we expect them to be like an elite offense, but we did expect there to be some uptick
No.
for the pass catchers like a Brandon Ayuk, a George
Yes.
Kittle. Um,
Yes.
but my thing with George Kittle is, and it's very similar to what I say with Kyle Pitts. Granted, he is, and I'll put him in the same boat. Like they've both been disappointing of where you drafted them. Some for injury, some for just lack of production. But what guy are you going to go out there and replace him with that can put up, are you going to go out there and replace him with, uh, you know, a Dalton Schultz with Cooper Rush, a David Njoku against the Chargers, a Tyler Conklin, you know, a guy kind of that's on the injury report in Dawson Knox, Hayden Hurst against Baltimore, Cole Kmet versus like those are the options that you would be replacing those guys.
Nope.
And at that point, like I would rather just take the shot in the dark with George Kittle and or Kyle Pitts if he goes. We talked about that game already. So yes, I am worried because it's not a return and investment value that I was hoping for, but he's still too talented of a player for him not to be in my lineup when the rest of the pool there is a significant drop off.
It's a great way to put it and a great way to calm down everybody on the tight end position because I think everyone wants that production. And we have to realize that even elite tight ends will have those 7-point weeks. And we have to be like, well, it's a tight end. But anyway, on the 49ers side, otherwise, I don't know if there's any thoughts on having Garoppolo in a streaming category this week. I'm thinking there's a lot of guys I like better. Debo Samuel always in your lineup. I don't think I've seen enough out of Brandon Ayuk to have him as a flex option. And then you're still rolling with the backfield as we have. I don't know why I'm blanking on a name right now. Cody, you can fill it in.
Jeff Wilson.
That's it. Yeah, Jeff Wilson. See.
Yeah, he's the
I'm
starter.
talking too much.
If you got him, good congrats. I know we were talking about, maybe some Davis Price before he got hurt. We were hoping maybe Jordan Mason got involved. But no, Jeff Wilson, he looks good. And he actually looked fast against the LA Rams last week, which is something that we haven't really seen from him. He had a breakaway touchdown like that. We haven't seen that the last 2 seasons. So he looks like he might finally be getting his legs back. You see why Kyle Shanahan loves him. So Jeff Wilson is startable this week.
And then going over to the Panthers side, you have Christian McCaffrey in your lineup. And I actually saw a league this week that DJ Moore got dropped. And I mean, obviously, immediately put a waiver claim in.
He has not played well. Not at all. George might have cut out. This is going to be interesting. I might just be talking to myself. So I'll see if he eventually comes back. But I'll explain to you what's going on with DJ Moore. He and Baker Mayfield are just not on the same page. He hasn't been playing very well. If you checked up the article, start sit, DJ Moore is on it. He's a sit candidate. He's not a guy I would be playing this week.
Yeah, I'm with you. I don't think I would start him this week, but like I honestly, especially in those leagues where I have a guy who's borderline droppable, I'm going out there and adding him because he's too talented and technically getting too many targets to be put on like the waiver wire. He should be rostered, and then you're sitting here hoping either he gets on the same page with Baker Mayfield a few weeks down the road, or like I know you were talking in one of our last 2 shows about there's rumors he could get traded. If he gets traded, that is a very talented wide receiver that could go to an offense that's running for a championship. Like that's someone you don't want to just have to have a waiver rush for later. You're better off sitting on him for 2, 3, 4 weeks and waiting to see what happens.
For sure, George. But I think that will wrap up that matchup. We got 2 more at the 4:00 window. So why don't we move on to your Philadelphia Eagles going to the Arizona Cardinals? Give us the rundown on the Eagles.
All right, I'll start with the Eagles running back situation because Miles Sanders is not going to see 27 carries again, especially since they're going to be playing now in a dome, and I'm sure they're going to get that passing game work back up. But Miles Sanders, I think, still has to be a starter in your lineup. He's been, I think it's an RB1 right now through the first 4 weeks, but I expect him to stay at RB2 / every week flex status as the Eagles keep going as long as he's healthy. In this matchup against the Cardinals, I would probably be a little bit wary of a Devontae Smith. I think you might have to play him if he's been one of your best guys in your flex position, but I'm trying, I think, to limit it to the A.J. Brown and Dallas Goedert out of the pass catchers. And then obviously Jalen Hurts is every week in your lineup as well. And I think my debate and my question for you, I'm someone who's been riding the Eagles defense off the waiver wire in a few leagues. And now coming into Arizona, their defense has been great, but obviously a not great matchup for a defense. Do you go out there and try to find another option like a Tennessee Titans? Or do you roll with the Eagles defense hoping that even if they give up points, they're going to get sacks and turnovers?
That's a great question. I would probably still roll with the Eagles. And this is kind of a little bit of a gamble. They've been playing so well. They're currently ranked number 2 against fantasy. Number 2 in fantasy. Wow, I completely blanked there. Maybe George thought I froze. We'll have to wait and see. But no, they're
No, you're
ranked number
good.
2, and the Arizona Cardinals have been tough, but they're only number 10. Like it's not like they're like the number 1 scoring option. They have put up points, but it's not been a lot. So we'll have to wait and see if they can. The big thing is how many sacks will they be able to get, because Kyler Murray can't escape the pocket. So if you wanted to take a gamble on going out and starting Tennessee versus Washington, I don't hate it. Um, the Eagles, they have the Cowboys the following week, then they're on bye week. So another bad matchup, then they're on bye. So it'd be holding the Eagles for a long time. So you could probably cut them, pick them up during your bye week. You want to get ahead of them week before. So I do like the possibility of streaming options this week. And then on the wide receiver side, I know you said something about be hesitant about Devonta Smith. And this is, I completely agree, but I do think you should be hesitant on AJ Brown as well, because
Hmm.
Byron Murphy, the defensive back for the Arizona Cardinals, has been elite this season. Now the question is, will he travel? Will he follow AJ Brown? If he does, I think that means really good things for Devonta Smith this week. If he doesn't, it'll go
Hmm.
back and forth depending on which side they're lined up on. You can play both. If he ends up, the Bill Belichick method of we'll put our best corner on the number 2 and double cover the 1, it could be, more of an AJ Brown type of game. So it'll be very interesting. And unfortunately, that's kind of stuff that only the coaches know. Um, so I would probably play both this week, but just know in the back of your mind, like this might not be another monster week for AJ Brown, despite projected high points total, because the best part of the Cardinals defense has been Byron Murphy so far this season.
It's good insight there. And then we're going to talk about all this. And then the Eagles' touchdowns are going to be a rushing touchdown for Jalen Hurts, a bomb to Quez Watkins, and a rushing touchdown for Kenny Gainwell. And it's going to help basically nobody. But that's the Eagles' offense is just going to roll. We know that already. It's just been good because they've been putting up so many points.
Right. And then I think that you're probably pretty accurate on how it's going to be guys that don't help our fantasy teams. But let's talk about guys that might help your fantasy team on the Cardinals side real quick. Kyler Murray, yes, it's a tough defense, but his rushing ability makes him as close to an every week starter as you can. Zach Ertz, he is the number 1 pass catching option, it seems. And then Hollywood Brown, he's a guy I want to talk about. He's a guy that hasn't seemed like he has been what we expected. Very similar to how we talked about Christian McCaffrey earlier in the week. But he's just been putting up, 3 straight weeks of double-digit points and getting catches and scoring points. And I do know the Eagles are a little banged up in the secondary. Uh, Darius Slay, I think, is limited. Avonte Maddox has been limited. I think they're expected to play, but it's just worth noting that they're a little banged up.
Slay was actually a full participant in the first 2 days, so he looks like he's good to go. Avonte Maddox was limited. I'm assuming, like you said, he will go, but we're not sure. Somebody on the Cardinals who I'm kind of speculative adding, similar to like Wan'Dale Robinson in the Giants game, is Rondale Moore. Because I didn't put him on the waiver article. He did not exactly perform well, but first week back from injury, first week playing this season, and they had him in there, I think 91% of snaps or something like that. It was a lot. He did get a decent amount of targets. They just couldn't really connect him and Kyler Murray. Even if he doesn't have a great game again, if he sees another 7 targets, if he's on the field 95% of the snaps, it's somebody you have to think about. Obviously, it's going to get a little bit blurry once you see DeAndre Hopkins coming back into the mix in a few weeks, but he is a one-play touchdown. Getting that much look, I think he might be a little bit of a sleeper kind of player coming down the stretch.
Yeah, and I just want to real quick reiterate what you said about DeAndre Hopkins coming back. If you're in a league that doesn't allow suspended players to be on IR, or check your waiver wire, DeAndre Hopkins might be sitting there. In Yahoo leagues, he's only rostered in 85% of them. which means there's 15% of leagues out there that DeAndre Hopkins is chilling on the waiver wire. Pick him up now. Pick him up next week. Get ahead of it before it's like, okay, DeAndre Hopkins back and everyone is rushing out there. So with the 6-game suspension coming to an end, just double check your waiver wire and see if you can make a huge addition to your team for the cost of nothing.
And he's owned in 93.7% of NFL.com leagues. Obviously, that's more because NFL.com does allow you to put a suspended player on your reserve, but still 6 and odd change percent of leagues, he's still sitting out there. Worth a look just to kind of check it out. But I think that'll wrap up Eagles Cardinals. We can move on to the Eagles division rival, the Dallas Cowboys, traveling to the Los Angeles Rams. On the Cowboys side, it looks like Dak will again be out this week. So it's another game for Cooper Rush, but this time he may be without CeeDee Lamb, who did not practice on Thursday with a groin injury. And now you have to think, Rams defense, solid. Backup quarterback, but has been playing well. With no Lamb, who do you think the number one receiver is, and is he worth taking a flyer on?
If I had to guess, it'd be Michael Gallup, who's 1 week removed coming off of a major injury. Now, he did catch a touchdown, so he did have a fantasy-relevant day, but you mentioned it. The Rams are a good defense. They're number one against running backs, which makes Zeke, he's on my sit list. Tony Pollard is questionable. You mentioned Cooper Rush. He's 4-0 as a starter for the Cowboys. We've heard all about it. 3-0 this season. But this is the Rams, America's game of the week. It might be his first loss. And honestly, if CeeDee Lamb doesn't go, I hope that it's Dalton Schultz, because I'm going to have a hard time not playing Dalton Schultz. But he put up a goose egg last week. So there's a lot of people out there that probably won't like that. And the Rams are very good against tight ends. So if Lamb doesn't go, I think I'm out on all Cowboys players.
It's really hard to play Dalton Schultz even with the weakness at tight end, because like you said, it was a goose egg last week. There were things a week before or week 2, one of those 2 weeks, he put up 0.9. I remember Tyler mentioning that one. When he got injured, but it's been so bad. I feel like I can find more targets off the waiver wire at a flyer tight end than Dalton Schultz at the moment. But the problem is, if he's going to have potential to be a number one passing target, you have to throw him out there.
So let me ask you a question with Dalton Schultz, because we saw what he did last year. Now, granted, that was mostly with Dak Prescott, but Dak Prescott is on the precipice of returning. It could be next week. It could be the week after that.
What a word there, by the way.
Thank you. I felt pretty confident with that one. In week 1, he had 9 targets with Dak Prescott. In the 2 games he's played with Cooper Rush, he missed week 3 because of injury. He's had 7 targets combined. Would you cut Dalton Schultz to pick up one of these streaming options? Would you hope and pray this week and then just keep him for if you have and hope that Dak Prescott comes back?
Ooh. I would not drop Dalton Schultz to get your replacement off the waiver wire. If you have another player on your bench who's droppable, then maybe you drop someone for a waiver wire stream. But especially hearing that makes me think so much better about Dalton Schultz when Dak Prescott gets back. Because when you're getting 9 targets as a tight end, you're going to have a couple of dud weeks. It's just how the position works. But you're going to be a top 5 tight end most likely with that kind of workload. So hold on and hope and play him if you have to, if you can't roster another tight end. But it's going to get better. I think Dak's supposed to be back in week 6. So...
Yeah, so George, I don't think we've let the listeners know. Me and you play each other in the League of Record this week, and I'm pretty sure where my roster's at, I can't afford to pick up and hold a tight end and hold Dalton Schultz. So Dalton Schultz might be played against you. So congrats on your win.
And I'm the one that's rostering 3 quarterbacks, but still has a solid bench. And I don't quite understand how that roster breakdown works, but I'll take it because that is the one league my head's spinning the whole entire time. But anyway, we're going to move on to Sunday Night Football. The Cincinnati Bengals against the... Oh, I am doing a really good job at that, this podcast here.
Okay, here, we'll talk about the Rams as quick as possible. Matt Stafford, you're not playing him. The dude is quarterback 25. Cam Akers, you could probably play him. He's overtaking Darrell Henderson. So, unfortunately, you're probably not playing Darrell Henderson. I don't think their offense hasn't been great enough to play both. So if you have to pick one, it'd be Cam Akers, which is unfortunate because Darrell Henderson had a really good week 1. Wide receiver wise, let me think. Cooper Kupp. Allen Robinson they try to get him involved. It just hasn't been working. He's another guy, like, don't cut him, but don't start him this week, especially against the Cowboys defense. They are a tough matchup. And then Tyler Higbee. He gets the targets. He hasn't been putting up a ton of points, but he is probably a solid streaming option this week.
Tyler Higbee has been the target monster of the tight end dartboard. And it's been working out that he probably has been near tight end 10 every single week. Just because of all those targets, even though it hasn't been pretty. All right, now we'll move on to Sunday Night Football. Cincinnati Bengals traveling to the Baltimore Ravens. T. Higgins for the Bengals was a limited participant, but I expect him to go. Traditionally, Baltimore, tough passing defense. They have not been quite as good this year, but the Bengals absolutely ran all over them last season. I don't think it's going to be that dramatically, bad again, but you have to think the Bengals are going to have a good offensive output.
Absolutely. And this is not the Ravens as old. Like, you got to get these old elite defenses out of your mind. The Ravens, through 4 weeks, are allowing the most points to fantasy wide receivers. So much so that I'm willing to say that you can start Jamar Chase, obviously, T. Higgins, and Tyler Boyd.
We finally found the week where Cody is confident enough to stream Tyler Boyd.
It's this week. I also really like it because he's picked up some momentum the last 2 weeks, and it's a great matchup, and it gives you some rooting interest or some hope for, I need Tyler Boyd to get me a touchdown to win my matchup on Sunday night. So I don't like to force storylines, but if it helps sway my decision, if I'm really close to a guy, I'll pick a guy playing on Sunday night just to give me an opportunity to stay in the game longer. And I think the matchup is really good this week for the Cincinnati Bengals.
And then moving on to the Ravens side, Rashad Bateman did not practice, and then backup running back Justice Hill, who looked pretty good last week, did not practice. I think that this locks in J.K. Dobbins as being startable as a running back to, if you need it, flex option. And I also think that you have to think about some streaming consideration for Devin Duvernay if he's going to be the number 1 wide receiver running routes out there.
Yeah, that is scary. I will say with J.K. Dobbins, though, don't force him in your lineup. If you look at the numbers, he had a 20-point game last week, but he did find the end zone twice, but he only had 41 rushing yards, 4 receptions, for 22 yards. So he had 60 yards in total. So it wasn't like a huge day for him as he works his way back. Definitely like him as an RB2 or flex, but not a guy if you were, went super heavy on those early running backs. Like if you have a Derrick Henry and an Aaron Jones, I'm not going to force J.K. Dobbins into my lineup. And if you have Derrick Henry and Aaron Jones, for that 3 listeners out there that have that combination, congrats to you on that. And then at wide receiver, man, if you told me I had to play Devin Duvernay, that is the ultimate. So if you're going to play Devin Duvernay, you have to look at your opponent and you're like, I need a huge week. I need a 70-yard touchdown. I need a big, explosion. Because he's going to get you 2 or he's going to get you 15. I don't really see a path for anything in between.
Pretty much, yeah. That's kind of how Devin Duvernay is going to be. But the Ravens' passing offense has been solid. So, I almost feel like you have to just consider it for that reason, just because if you're not going to have Bateman at wide receiver 1, they've been good.
I'll just fill in for Tyler again. If Bateman doesn't go, I'd be more confident playing Isaiah Likely than I would Devin Duvernay. If you need a stream tight end out there.
I mean, I get it. Likely has been getting targets, but that's a real shot in the dark.
Oh, it 100% is a real shot in the dark. He has 5 fantasy points all season.
Yeah.
That's it. So, I'm talking real shot in the dark here. But if Bateman doesn't go, like, obviously Mark Andrews is going to get his, but I think Isaiah likely could be the secondary option. And then Dever Duvernay will still be over the top. Like, it'll be very interesting to see how this offense go that was already, lackluster at wide receiver and has now lost their second-year wide receiver first-round pick, potentially.
That's very true. But I mean, there's not really much else besides Mark Andrews then that you're planning on starting there like as a lock for Baltimore. But I feel like there's going to be points put up, so you just got to try to find where you think they're going to come from. Maybe it's likely, maybe it's Duvernay, maybe it's both, maybe it's all Mark Andrews. Who knows? But we have one more game to talk about here, and I know we're running a little long, so I'll bring us into Monday Night Football. The Las Vegas Raiders traveling to the Kansas City Chiefs, and finally, good news. Hunter Renfrow was a full participant in practice on Thursday, coming back from his concussion. That tells me he should be good to go for this week and the end of the run of Mac Hollins.
You just hope it's the end of the run for Mac Hollins. I think you're right, but I feel like you're extra invested in this end for Mac Hollins.
Don't make me sound like the bad guy. I mean, like, I don't want to wish failure on anybody, not on the Dallas Cowboys, but how could you tell me that Mac Hollins is going to stay relevant? Like, I feel like he's only been relevant because Hunter Renfrow has not really played too much this season because he's been out with that concussion.
Yeah, and I'm really excited for this matchup because when the Chiefs and the Raiders get together, even when the Raiders weren't very good, they always seem to play the Chiefs tough. It was always a shootout game.
Mm-hmm.
Like, these teams just know how to put up points. And I think Derek Carr getting Hunter Renfrow back will open things up for Devontae Adams, open things up for Darren Waller. I would play Hunter Renfrow if he's back from his concussion. Those are the three pass catcher options. I think Josh Jacobs, you could probably do a little bit of chasing points. I don't know if he'll have as huge of a week, but he'll still be a running back 2 option, flexible if you need it, type guy in this matchup. So I think Hunter Renfrow could open up a lot of things and potentially help the Raiders carry their momentum after winning their first game last week.
I like it. It's also worth noting Darren Waller was a limited participant, but I don't see any reason he would not go. And then moving on to the Chiefs side, Mr. Sell High, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, was a recipient of a magic-looking touchdown last week. The Raiders, maybe not like the worst or best matchup, somewhere in the middle, I'm pretty sure, against running backs.
Actually,
Clyde Edwards-Helaire, probably.
So
Oh, wow, that's actually...
They're pretty low.
Yeah.
So Clyde Edwards-Helaire
I think Clyde Edwards-Helaire has to be in your lineup, definitely, then. Yeah.
Do you know he's running back 4 on the season so far?
With like 5 rushing yards. I mean, it probably went up a lot last week. I think he got like 90 something last week. But before that, he was at like 40 something rushing yards, and he was all touchdowns and pass catching. Which, I mean, if you're playing in a PPR, he's been very good at the running back position. I just didn't think it was sustainable, and now here we are. You have to kind of think to an extent it might be.
Yeah, he's looking good, but this is also why he was a sell high candidate on the earlier show this week, because of where he was at in terms of how many touchdowns he's getting versus how many rushing yards. So not a guy you have to trade, but is a guy that might have higher trade value now than he will in a few weeks. But let's talk about the pass catchers real quick before we get out of here. Has any of them separated themselves outside of Travis Kelce, because he's in your lineup every week? Your Juju Smith-Schuster, your Sky Moore, your Marquez Valdez-Scantling, your Mecole Hardman. Has any of them separated them? This is another game. We're expecting a lot of points, but I'm having a hard time saying which guy I want to put in my lineup. If I had to choose, I'd probably go Juju, but I don't feel great about it.
I know you don't feel great about it because especially the way that I think they're using Juju, not only is he like not the number 1 pass catching target, that's always going to be Travis Kelce, but he's also not getting the most yards per catch and that kind of thing because he's kind of being used in the short to intermediate, and he's still number 2 on that team in targets. So you're telling, like, I don't see any way you can say that MVS or Sky Moore or, you know, any of those other guys, Mecole Hardman, are going to be better than Juju any given week just because you're going to go for the guy that's getting the looks. But you're just going to have to see, like, who happens to get the touchdown. Maybe, like, Marquez Valdez-Scantling had more yards last week than Juju on less catches because he had a couple of big plays. I'd still rather play the safe play rather than go out there, unless it's like a bye week or a bunch of injuries and I'm desperate, then maybe you throw an MVS in your lineup, but not just in this situation do I throw anybody out there but Juju.
Alrighty. I think that's good advice. We definitely went a little long, but we had some really great conversation. And we encourage you to join the conversation over on our Discord channel. The link is in the description. Um, because as Tyler, who we have mentioned numerous times, is not here, he always likes to remind you that this podcast is more fun for us and more fun for you when you get involved. But as always, thanks for listening.
Yes, Cody, thank you all one more listening. But thank you all one more time for listening into the Couch GMs podcast. For Cody Roadcap, I'm George Kerth, and we'll see you all next week.